Armchair explorations. Okay, perfect. Well, I think we'll go ahead and get rolling here. So I just want to welcome everybody to another Armchair Exploration series to kind of kick things off. Today, Zegrahm art historian Allan Langdale will be giving a talk entitled The Hippodrome of Constantinople. So before I introduce Allan, we just want to remind you of a few housekeeping things. We're going to be putting everyone on mute, so we ask that you do remain on mute for the duration of the presentation. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll find your video and your mute settings, as well as the chat function. If you have any questions for Allan during the presentation, you can enter them into the chat, and the Zegrahm team will kind of behind the scenes collect everything and be sure to address those at the end of the talk. And additionally, there will be time at the end of the presentation to unmute yourself and ask questions to Allan at that time if you wish to do so. Allan will be going into presenter mode in just a bit, so you will soon see his screen. If you have any trouble with that, you can again use the chat and the Zegrahm team will help you out as best we can. If for some reason something drops off or gets disconnected, the same link that you used to join this meeting is the one that you can join again to re-enter the meeting. So now I just want to talk a little bit about Allan and his background. Allan's coming to us today from Victoria, Canada, and he feels a bit like a fish out of water not being able to travel, which I can say the same for all of us. So we hope this provides another hour or so escape from wherever you are and wherever you've been holed up during COVID-19. Allan spent most of his childhood in a small mill town on Vancouver Island in Canada, wondering what the rest of the world was like. And then he went on to spend much of his adult life finding out. He's always loved adventure and believes that travel is the most total of all educational experiences. Allan has a PhD in art history from UC Santa Barbara and went on to teach many courses on ancient Greek and Roman, Byzantine, and Italian Renaissance art and architecture. Allan is currently a lecturer in art history at UC Santa Cruz. For over a decade, Allan has worked on board as Zegrahm expedition staff, focused around the Mediterranean, Adriatic, and Black Seas. And I've been lucky enough to travel with Allan to those places, and I've learned so much from him. He has many talents, including being a travel writer and a film producer. Allan was the co-producer, writer, co-director, and host of The Stones of Famagusta, The Story of a Forgotten City, which was an award-winning documentary on the history and architecture of Famagusta, Cyprus. Some of his published books include Palermo, Travels in the City of Happiness, Art, History, and Architecture in Sicily's Ancient Capital, A Survey of Archaeology and Historical Architecture of Northern Cyprus, and connecting to the topic of our live event today, the Hippodrome of Constantinople / Istanbul, an illustrated handbook of its history. He's written numerous articles, and that list is way too long for me to rattle off right now. And on top of all of these things, he's an excellent photographer, and I know many of his images will show up in the slideshow today. So without further ado, I'd like to once again give a warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining today, and I'm gonna pass things over to you, Allan.
Kelsey, thank you very, very much. I appreciate that introduction. I'm hoping that at this point, everybody is seeing a slide that says the Hippodrome of Constantinople with a kind of cartoony type image below. So I hope that all of that is fine. Welcome. Yes, I think I started working for Zegrahm like something like 15 years ago, and the Black Sea was a trip that was a regular on our itineraries, and it's a absolutely fabulous and incredibly unique trip. And yes, and working for Zegrahm is really not just a pleasure, but also a kind of honor. The educational components of Zegrahm trips, I'm sure those of you who have been on them know what I'm talking about. You don't just get one lecturer, but you get a geologist, a botanist, an avian specialist. You get an art historian, you get an archaeologist, you get a cultural historian, you get an anthropologist, you get a marine biologist, a marine archaeologist, and so it's a wonderful team, and these people are always so wonderful to work with. Well, let's start our lecture for today. Now, the title of this lecture is, as Kelsey mentioned, based on a book that I published earlier this year, actually, on the Hippodrome of Constantinople. So, I'm sure that many of you know that the city of Istanbul has had two names previous to that. It was first known as Byzantium, hence our word Byzantine, as in describing the Byzantine Empire. But for many, many centuries, it was Constantinople, the capital of a vast Eastern Roman Empire. I'm not going to deal too much with the history of that. That's kind of another lecture altogether. What I'm going to focus on today is a particular type of entertainment that was very, very popular in the Roman and Byzantine periods. And this, of course, is chariot racing. And chariot races took place in a structure called a hippodrome. That's a Greek word, hippodrome, literally a place where horses run. But the Romans had a different word. They also called this a circus, from which we get a kind of more modern derivation as well. Now, one of the reasons why people, when they think about entertainment in the ancient world, partially because of Hollywood, you always think of gladiatorial spectacles. Those are the type of spectacles and fights that would happen in an amphitheater. And of course, the most famous amphitheater in the world is the Colosseum in Rome. But a 5-minute walk away from the Colosseum in Rome is a deep depression in the ground. And this was the ancient Circus Maximus of Rome. This was their hippodrome. This is where the chariot races took place. Now, the reason why I mention Rome here and these general ideas is because when we go to one of the reasons why people don't know much about chariot racing is that almost nothing of hippodromes survives. As you see here, there's almost nothing of the Circus Maximus, the largest and most important hippodrome in the entire empire. So if we want to understand what happened in the Hippodrome of Constantinople in Istanbul, which only survives partially, we really have to travel throughout the Mediterranean. We have to look at other sites where there are hippodromes. We have to look at artifacts and works of art that are associated with chariot racing. By studying those, we can go into the hippodrome in Istanbul and we can really understand and recreate the things that happened in that place. Now, many people walk through the depression of the Circus Maximus. But if any of you have been to Rome and you've gone to the Via Appia, you were very close. And by the way, do you see the road on the left-hand side? Well, that corresponds to the ancient Via Appia, south of Rome. Here, one of the best preserved circuses or hippodromes survives. And this is the Hippodrome of Maxentius. And I think you can clearly see that kind of bullet shape that elongated bullet shape that characterizes the racetrack. By the way, I was thinking the other day, what modern day sport most resembles chariot racing? And the thing that I came up with in the end was NASCAR racing in America, right? Because you've got these vehicles that are going around and around a track, and of course the crowds of many thousands cheering on their teams. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the Hippodrome of Maxentius is that many of its architectural components survives. For example, do you see that long, thin section there? Well, that is called the spina, like a spine, right? And that is the thing around which the chariots race in a counterclockwise direction. By the way, a race of chariots would take 7 laps. So you do 7 laps around this spina. Now, another word that is more commonly used to describe this architectural feature is Euripus, E-U-R-I-P-U-S. Okay, now take a look at this. Do you see those? There's some little markings in a sort of curve there. Those are the carceres, or the starting gates for the chariots. There were always 12 chariots. Now, it already emerges a kind of interesting thing. 7 laps around the track, 7 days in a week, 12 charioteers, 12 months of the year. Okay, so the idea of the circus and the idea of the hippodrome races, and of course you all know that the, Apollo, or well, Helios, the sun god, would drive a chariot. So these races were also symbolic of the changing of the year. In other words, and the chariot racing days often corresponded to certain festival days, the spring festival, fall festival, summer festivals, things like that. So the idea of the circus is related to our word circuit, which means like the circuit of sun around the earth. Now, you'll notice that at the ends of the spina, there's also these little knobby things, and these are called metae. And I'll show you close-ups of all of these things momentarily. So let's take a closer look at these elements. And by the way, we'll be getting to Istanbul soon enough, but bear with me as we learn more about chariot racing in general. Now, there's the carceres, or the starting gates, or the foundations from them, and you can see them curved there. You see those young women who are having a picnic in the grass. Well, they would be in a very dangerous place indeed when the chariot race started, because they would have the chariots, each of which had 4 horses, by the way. They were called quadriga, quad, of course, denoting the 4 horses. And I'll show you another view here with the monumental gates. And this is a good picture that shows the curve. Now, each one of these carceres was kind of like a small garage. You had to cram the 4 horses and the chariot into that little garage. And then there were metal gates, or sometimes wooden gates, that kept the horses. And the gates would all open at once, just like in a modern horse race. So modern horse racing does owe a certain kind of debt to the technology of the starting gates that happened in the ancient chariot races. Now, I mentioned so here's the Euripus. Now, remember those little knobs at the end? The meta, or the metae is the plural. Okay, so the one that was closest to the starting gates was called the meta prima, and of course the one that is farthest away was called the meta secunda, or the second meta. Now, this particular one is interesting because it was a big tower that was filled with water. Now, why in the world would there be a kind of large cistern here? And basically what it was a kind of water tower, or pressure tower. Well, what was its function? Its function was to fill the Euripus with a series of little waterfalls. And this area would also have been decorated by sculptures, by obelisks, by all kinds of trophies and other types of decorations. So the pressure tower on the first meta, the meta prima, supplied water to flow into the space of the Euripus. In other words, the Euripus was like a flowing river down the middle of the spina of the hippodrome. Not all hippodromes or circuses had this feature, but some of them do, and the one here at the Hippodrome of Maxentius is by far the best preserved. So you can imagine these little waterfalls as the water flowing, and of course there's a drain at the other end. Now, these metae were also decorated by, and made more monumental and tall, by these things, these kinds of projections here that they're sort of, they usually had little balls on the end, kind of like that. And these they kind of look like, they always remind me of bowling pins with balls on the top. This was also a typical kind of decoration for for hippodromes or circuses as well. And part of the function of that was so that the charioteers could easily see where the turn was coming up, right, from a distance. Their vision was not obscured. They knew the distance. Now, one of the main ways in which we learn about chariot racing in the ancient world is by looking at works of art from the Roman period that depict chariot races. Probably one of the most informative is this one, which is in the Gallo-Roman Museum, in Lyon, in France. And this was on a floor. So this was a big floor mosaic and was probably belonged to someone who was, of course, very wealthy and who probably owned a charioteer, and charioteers were often slaves, by the way, and owned the horses and owned a stable. Now, what do we learn from the Lyon mosaic? Well, we learned that not all starting gates were made of stone. Here, it's made very clear that the starting gates of the Lyon Hippodrome were made of timber, so they were made of wood rather than stone. The other thing we realize is that although the cartures might have been not constructed of stone, it did have a Euripus with the water. And you'll notice that there are these little fountains. If you look to the left, you can see what looks like fish. Well, those are dolphins. And how many dolphins were there? 7 dolphins. And so at each lap, those were lap counters. So when one lap was finished, one of the dolphins would tip over and water would come out of its mouth. Now, you'll notice here that all the dolphins are tipped over, which means that this is the end of the race. And you can see the starting line in the lower section in the middle, right? So we see that a charioteer who is wearing a white costume has won the race. Notice that the charioteers wear clothing that is colored. That is because there were always 4 teams: red team, white team, green team, and blue team. And in the Lyon mosaic, these different team colors are shown. Notice that in the top right and the bottom left, they have had accidents. And the most common place to have an accident was just after you either going into a turn or just finishing a turn. And the name for this accident, say if you crashed, this was called a naufragia, which literally means a shipwreck. So you can see that a red and looks like maybe a blue charioteer have had a naufragia. Okay, all right. So, and also here it shows the kind of bowling pin, mete, it shows the obelisk in the middle, these types of things. Now, you notice here, there's a green charioteer, but you notice that there's also a single person on horseback. This person on horseback is part of the green team, and what they are is a hortator. And a hortator is someone who cheers on his team from horseback as the chariots are going around. We get our word exhortation from this word hortator. You'll also notice, well, there's the finish right there. A white charioteer has just narrowly beat out a red charioteer. And I also wanted to show you that this is an opus sectile work, which is kind of like a mosaic. And it shows the charioteer, in this case, with what's called a biga, or a 2-horse chariot. And behind him are the red, blue, green, and white charioteer teams, what are called the circus factions, the team factions. And in the lower right-hand corner of the Lyon mosaic, you see another strange figure who seems to be holding bowling pins, but what he's holding are long, slender amphoras filled with water. He is a sparsor, and his job, you notice he's wearing 2 colors, so I don't know whether he's supposed to be a blue charioteer or a white charioteer, or sparsor. So his job is to fling cool water onto the horses to cool them down as they go in their race. So not only chariots were on the track, but hortators and sparsors were also on the track. That must have been a pretty dangerous job. Kind of like a, like a rodeo clown who has to take the bull away afterwards. There's another green sparsor in the upper left. He has a sort of bit of water that he's going to fling on the green charioteer as he approaches. And this image shows a little bit closer those dolphins who have tilted over, so that the lap counter dolphins, that the 7 of them that kind of let everybody in the audience know what lap it is. Now you'll also see, by the way, on the right-hand side of this detail, an obelisk. Obelisks were important decorations. They were the most common type of decoration for the Euripus of a hippodrome. Why is this? Well, because obelisks, of course, are from Egypt, and they are related to the sun. Most obelisks had golden orbs on top of them. So they were dedications to the sun god. And the ancient Romans knew this. So the idea of having an object dedicated to the sun god in a building in which the races were symbolic of the passage of days and weeks and months and years, this made perfect sense for them. Now, let's finally get to Istanbul. This is an aerial view of the area of the Hippodrome. And when people, and by the way, that's sort of, you can just see the atrium of the Blue Mosque off to the right, upper right. Now, most people, when you go to Hippodrome Square, and you can see the 2 obelisks that are still there, they sort of think, okay, well, this square is the shape of the Hippodrome. This is how big it was. Okay, yeah, I guess that's a little bit impressive. Except the thing is they're actually not seeing. And make sure everybody is, please make sure your microphones are muted. Thank you very much. But in fact, you are not seeing the full scope of the Hippodrome at all. Look at the buildings in the lower half of this image, and you'll notice the curvature at the bottom. That is the Sfendone. That is the only physical part of the architecture of the ancient Hippodrome. So the Hippodrome was actually much, much larger than the Hippodrome Square that we see today. So this is important. Now let's take a look. Let's take a look at this wonderful Antoine Albert reconstruction, because you can see this Sfendone just to the left there. Okay, so that gives you an idea of what it really looked like in its heyday. Okay. Now, here's what it looks like in plan. I'm gonna kind of move pretty fast through this because we've already talked about that. There's the Euripus, or the spina. There's the Sfendone, which is the curved section. Now, also there was a imperial viewing platform. So the emperor and the empress and their entourage had special seats. They had a skybox. They had a skybox that, of course, was, the people couldn't go up there. It was a special place. And it was connected to the imperial palace. So the emperor and his entourage could walk directly from the palace into the kathisma, into their skybox, and of course, watch the chariot races that they themselves were sponsoring. Some people may ask, did the people have to pay a ticket? No, they did not. They were free. They were considered to be a gift from the emperor to the people. And at the end of the races, by the way, they were given food. They were given fish. They were given fruit, vegetables. In other words, there was a big food giveaway at the end as well. Notice here too that the charioteers. Now, one of the things you might ask is, why are the charioteers curved? Well, any of you who ran track when you were younger, at least a race that was longer than 100 meters, you know that you have to stagger. You have to stagger the starting gates, or the starting lines, so that each charioteer races to the same point and it's the same distance, right? So it's a question of fairness. If it was a straight line, then the charioteer in cartier number 12 would have actually a farther distance to go than in the first and second and third and so forth. Now, I mentioned the Sfendone, this curved area. Let's take a look at what's left of that in Istanbul today. oh yes, this is wonderful. Look at this wonderful 16th century print by Onofrio Pavanius. Well, he may not have done the print, but he wrote a book about hippodromes. And you'll notice that the Sfendone has kind of two levels, and there's columns there, right? Okay, so this is partially a kind of imaginary thing, but nevertheless, it's kind of interesting. It shows the charioteers still surviving today. Nothing of them survives. So let's take a look at the Sfendone. Okay, yeah. Now here's a picture taken in the late 19th century. You cannot take this picture now, but this is the lowest level of the Sfendone. Now, why did they have to build this? Well, they had to build this because the hippodrome was almost 500 meters long. And but the land was not flat for 500 meters. So it stuck out and there was a little kind of slope down to the sea. So they had to build this section up to create a flat area for the seating in that particular part of the building. And this large foundation of the Sfendone, and so you have to imagine actually 2 levels above it where the seating was sloped up in the curve. Today, you can still see parts of the Sfendone, and this is a picture I took just a few years ago. So you can see the curve very clearly. Now, in the garden of the Blue Mosque is the only surviving seat of the hippodrome. And so you can still see it there, and we have kids often sitting there and smoking. But that's the last marble seat of the hippodrome. Now, let's take a look at the monuments in the Euripus of the Hippodrome in Istanbul. All right, so here we go. I'm going to go a little faster because I'm eating up a lot of time. But you have the 2 obelisks, but you also have this thing called the serpent column, which is a sort of spiral bronze object. Now, this is a 16th century depiction of it. You notice that in up until 1700, you could see the snake heads, right? So it was a spiral thing with snake heads. And if you look in some Ottoman manuscript illustrations, you also see the obelisks and also the snake-headed serpent column, as well as the Egyptian obelisk, which was put up there as well. So there it is. That's what's left of the serpent column, which you see in the foreground. The obelisk in the background actually is not an ancient obelisk. I'm not going to talk too much about that because it's called the built obelisk or the masonry obelisk. But I'm going to focus first on, so there's a view of that just to give you an idea of what it looks like. Now, the serpent column, interestingly, was not made there, and it was already almost 800 years old when the hippodrome in Constantinople was constructed. It was taken from Delphi, where it had been a kind of a monument that commemorated the Battle of Plataea from 480 BC. And I'm just going to show you close-ups of that, and that is what it probably looked like originally. So it was a stand for a votive tripod in Delphi. And the other interesting thing is the reason why it was dedicated to Apollo was because the Greeks beat the Persians at the Battle of Plataea. And you can still see today all the inscriptions. They're hard to see, admittedly, but there's the inscriptions of all the city-states that got together to fight the Persians and defeat them. It takes a little, you have to have the right light, but you can still see some of these inscriptions in Greek even today. So there's an example of some of them, and there's a photograph I took. The light has to be just perfect to see those ancient Greek inscriptions. So this is an object that is, as I say, it's 700-800 years older than the hippodrome itself. There's a story that, you might say, well, what the heck happened to those snakeheads? Well, one of the stories is that Mehmet the Conqueror in 1453, when he entered the city, he thought that they were pagan gods, and so he threw his mace at one of the snake heads and knocked it off. But then finally a monk said, no, 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 they're not religious, they're not gods, they're just, they're good luck charms that keep snakes from the city. And so Mehmed said, okay, well, I'll leave the other two snake heads. Well, eventually they fell off and were lost. And the only part of the snake head that survives is in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, and that's part of it there. Okay, let's now take a look at this. One of the most incredible monuments was this obelisk. Well, it's actually an obelisk from Egypt. It's broken. It lost its bottom third and somewhere in transportation from Egypt. And the bottom third has never been found. So if you see it at a yard sale, please do snap it up, okay? Now, what happened with the erection of this obelisk, which dates from 1400, well, more than 1400 BCE. So here too, this particular object was, 1800 years old when it was brought to Constantinople. And it was brought to Constantinople by, it was used by a guy named Theodosius, okay? Now, a base was constructed for this obelisk, and this is an extraordinary object in many ways, and I'm going to spend some time with that. Notice, by the way, that there's see that little hole in the corner, okay? I'm going to show you something about that later. So you've got imperial reliefs on all four sides of this base, and these are really, really interesting, and I'll show you why. Now, see this red line? That's the ground line today, right? But the old ground line is at the yellow thing. So for example, if we look at this wonderful photograph from the 19th century, we see that the ground level is indeed quite different than it is today. So today the ground level is like that. And that little hole in the corner there is a hole that somebody put so they could tie their donkey to it or their horse. And there's a close-up of it. Okay, let's take a look at some of these reliefs here because they're quite interesting. They show in the upper level Theodosius, the emperor himself, his empress, and probably his two sons, and then soldiers who are guarding him, his sort of Praetorian guard. At the bottom level, you see foreigners who are bringing gifts to the emperor. So, for example, from the eastern side, you have Persians who are bringing gifts. From the western side, you are bringing Goths or Germans who are bringing gifts. So the idea is that they meet in the center. People who Theodosius has conquered in both the east and the west are now subject to him. And so this is the gift-giving ceremony that opens that also echoes or parallels the rituals and ceremonies that would have opened the chariot racing day. Now, there's a detail, this is from, of course, 1935, when the reliefs were much more legible than they are now. A lot of the hair coats that were on the Goths are now barely visible. And then here's the Persians arriving from the east with their distinctive Phrygian hats. Now, another one of the faces of the Theodosian obelisk base is this one that shows the emperor probably extending a laurel wreath to give to a victorious charioteer. Below him, however, is a very interesting depiction of the crowd itself. So this is a depiction of the Hippodrome crowd. How many people could be there? At least 50,000, and maybe as many as 80,000 people attended the chariot races here in this Hippodrome. And by the way, these reliefs are very similar to other reliefs we find in other elements of Byzantine art. So for example, this one here, the famous Lampadi diptych, which is an ivory diptych in the museum in Brescia. And here you see the emperor, right, and his cohorts on the top, and in the bottom, you see the chariot race. So this is a fairly common type of depiction. Okay, so there's a division between, there's the upper part, Okay, and there's the lower part that shows the chariot race. Now, in the details here, it's quite interesting because the top row and the second row, they just show heads, right? This is the crowd. But look at the lower register, and what you see are cheerleaders. You see women who are in diaphanous dresses, and they're dancing, right? So each one of the teams, white, blue, green, and red, they had their own cheerleaders. Moreover, there is also musicians. For example, you can just see here somebody on the lower left blowing some horns, and a little bit to the right of middle, you see the pipes of a pipe organ. Each one of the circus factions had their own organ. So it's kind of like when you go to a hockey game and they go, da, 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 the organ player gives you some music. Well, not a new idea. These pipe organs were also part of the entertainment and the sonic backdrop of a hippodrome. And again, if we go back to the 1935 pictures, the pipe organ on the left-hand side and the man blowing the panpipes just to the right of center, and indeed the cheerleaders dancing themselves, are more legible. So there they are. There's the panpipe guy and the pipe organ. And there's the other pipe organ that I showed you a moment ago as well. And there's some of the cheerleaders, really quite legible. So, hey, sports hasn't changed that much in all of this time. Now, we also learn about these things in a particular type of medal that's called a contorniate, which is a commemorative medal that the emperor gave to the audience. And so these coins are also show Hippodrome events. And I'll show you another one later. And I took this picture in Sicily at Piazza Armerina, where there's a large mosaic showing a hippodrome race. And here you see the bread sellers. The bread sellers are selling the bread to the people in the crowd. Okay, it's all like round pita bread. So back to, now notice that the obelisk base in Istanbul not only has an upper part, but a lower section as well. And this lower section is pretty interesting. They have, on one side is a Greek inscription, and on the other side is a Latin inscription, but they both essentially say the same thing. This column with four sides, only the Emperor Theodosius to lift up against its burden. Proclus was invited to execute his order, and this great column stood up in 32 days. So we learned that Theodosius erected this. We learned that it took about a month to put up. And we also learned that he's sort of like the mayor or the manager of the city, Proclus, was in charge of this. And as I say, on the opposite side, you have the same inscription in Latin. And there you can see Theodosius's name. Okay? And there's just slightly longer, but it still says the same thing. Now, in both Greek and Latin inscriptions, by the way, this is kind of interesting. You see the name Proclus, and you see that it has been kind of erased or something. Well, there's a story behind this, because after this was done, Proclus was accused of a crime, and he was put to death. And so his name was erased from this inscription. But a few years later, it emerged that Proclus had been innocent, and he had been put to death, unjustifiably. So his name was reinstated, which is why his reinstated name appears in a kind of slot that is recessed back from the face of the reliefs. On the other faces of the lower block, wonderful, you see a chariot race itself, which is in some ways, a relief version of the Leon mosaic that we looked at a little bit earlier. So you see there's, again, 1935 photograph. So you can see the charioteers with their four horses. You can see, yes, I'm just kind of throwing this in, but this is a wonderful relief from Foligno, and it shows the carceres, it shows charioteers, it shows an obelisk, it shows the mete, right? All of the different parts. So in other words, the relief of the chariot race that we see in Istanbul is not totally unique. There many sarcophagi, for example, in the Roman period also had hippodrome or chariot race motifs. And by the way, there's one of the sparsaurs in the corner. And we see the same thing at Istanbul. We see sparsaurs with their long, slender amphoras throwing water on the horses as they make their turn on the Meta Secunda. Okay, so there's one there and one there. So it looks like they're dancing, but they're actually just winding up to throw the water so they can throw the water a good distance. And we remember, of course, our little sparsaur from the Lyon mosaic as well. So these details are really quite remarkable. Now the other face, the fourth face of the lower part of the obelisk face shows the erection of the obelisk itself. But I'm gonna kind of skip by this. It's sort of interesting, but you have all these engineers who are conferring, and you have all these workers who are turning screws to try to put pressure on and lift this immense object. Now, sometimes we have to look at other artifacts that are, this object was found in Istanbul, but it's actually now in a museum in Berlin. And it's called the Kugelspiel, but I don't have time to tell you all these things about these things, but I want you to look to the upper register. And do you see how there's a kind of jar that has been turned upside down? Well, this is called the turning of the urn. And what you would have is there would be 4 balls inside the urn, a red, a white, a green, and a blue. And you would turn the urn, and if a blue ball came out, then the blue charioteer got first choice of which carteret he wanted to be in. And so you see on the left-hand side, you see one of the guys is cheering. He says, "Yay, my ball came out." And the other guy's kind of cracking his whip. He says, "Darn, I didn't win." So these are other ways in which we can understand. And that turning of the urn or the rolling of the urn also appears on contorniate medals. Now, I want to end by talking about a guy named Porphyrius. Porphyrius was the greatest charioteer of all time. And he had a couple of, he had more than 2 monuments, but 2 statue bases of statues that were on the spina in the Hippodrome survive. Now, and I'm showing you 2 faces from 2 of these different statue bases. So his statue would have been on top of these, but they're quite interesting. For example, you'll see in this one here, on the image on the left, on the upper section, you can see him in his chariot, and then 2 Nike figures or victory figures are putting the laurel wreath on his head. And then the lower section, do you see where there's 2 people and they have 2 sets of horses? This refers to the diversium. This was always the last race of the day. By the way, how many races were there in a day? 24, of course. But the last one, 24 hours in a day, yeah. And this was called a hippocon. This was a big horse race day. So at the last race, for the last race, you would take the 2 best charioteers of the day, and they would exchange horses. And then they would race again, just the 2 of them. And of course, if the winner of that race, the diversium, really showed that they won because of their skill, not because they had better horses. So here again, we see Porphyrius victorious, and I'll show you some details of those. You notice that he's wearing a kind of girdle to which the reins were attached. This was so that if he dropped the reins would not fall into the horse's hooves. These kinds of things are also visible on these contorniate, so I just kind of reiterate that these kinds of images were found more widely in the visual culture of the ancient world. And I love this one. This is a mosaic. I don't know if any of you have been to Merida in Spain, but there's a wonderful site. There's actually a fairly well-preserved hippodrome there. And there's this wonderful mosaic in the museum. And it shows a charioteer, and we know that the name, it says along the top, Marcian Nikas. In other words, Marcian wins. His lead horse is called Illuminator, and he's given a name. And he actually, we also know, what stable he belongs to, because the brand is on his body. It says Getuli. And it's very likely that the owner of Marcian and the owner of the Getuli stables, this was probably on the floor of his house, because why else would he advertise somebody else's somebody else's horses or somebody else's charioteer? Now, I want to end by rather something that may seem a little strange, because you're probably looking at this and go, wait a minute, isn't that the Church of St. Mark in Venice? Well, yes, it is. But in you know the history of Constantinople. You know that in 1204, the Venetians sacked the city of Constantinople, and they looted it with hundreds of shiploads of material were taken, especially from the Hippodrome. And unfortunately, most of the bronze statues, like the statues of Porphyrius, were melted down. But the Venetians didn't melt down all the bronze statues, because they did take the 4 horses that decorated the entrance to the Hippodrome of Constantinople, and they set these horses up in the facade of the Church of San Marco. Today, these are the last sculptural vestiges of the Hippodrome of Constantinople. They used to be attached to a chariot and had a charioteer behind them. But this, just imagine the glory of it. And I love going up to the little museum that they have in the Church of San Marco in Venice and looking at these horses. And you know, you can almost hear the sound of the hooves of the racing horses of the chariots and the cheering crowd back in Constantinople and Istanbul. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed that, and I hope you have some questions for me as well.
Thanks, Alan. That was great. I did not know that about those horses. That's so fascinating. So we don't have anything in the chat. So if anybody has a question, feel free to unmute yourself at this time. There's also a few people or a few expedition staff on the call that do the Black Sea. So if you have questions about just kind of Istanbul in general or the Black Sea, these guys are more than capable of handling those questions.
Thanks, Kelsey. That's really great. Okay, so you should be able to see me now, I guess. You probably see everybody. So if you want to ask a question, you can use the chat button, but you can also unmute yourself. Let's see here. So I have a question, one question from Sue Jordan. When did chariot racing end as a sport? Well, that's a very excellent question. Because, you know, we could also ask, when did gladiatorial, you know, things end? Well, gladiator things, of course, came to an end when the Roman Empire was Christianized. The Christians didn't much like this, you know, the gladiator things. I mean, here they had died in the amphitheaters. Now, what happened with chariot racing is, the emperors started, you know, after the 8th or 9th century, the Byzantine emperors, excuse me, they started to run out of money. And the Byzantine Empire, starting in really the late 7th, especially early 8th century, started to be invaded by Islamic groups. And so they started to lose territory. And so all the money, and then when they lost territory, they lost their tax base. They lost a lot of, you know, finances. So a lot more money had to be put towards the military because the empire was in trouble because of the expansion of Islam. And so these chariot races were hugely expensive, unbelievably expensive. And so probably the last races were done around the year 1000. And at that time, Western influence was very, very strong. And the Westerners liked jousting. And so we have records that they turned the Hippodrome into a jousting stadium, and there were no longer any more chariot races. So excellent question. So I have a question from Diane Roberts. How did they transport the obelisk from Egypt? By boat? Yes, by a barge. There was a special barge that was constructed for it. The first person to bring obelisks from Egypt was Augustus. And this was, Augustus brought at least two large obelisks from Egypt to Rome, also because remember he had defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And so this was also a symbol of his victory. So he brought these monuments back to Rome, and he was the first one to set up an obelisk in the Circus Maximus. Those obelisks are now in different parts of Rome. One of them is in the Piazza del Popolo. So if you've been to Rome, you've seen those obelisks. So yes, so that's also an excellent question, Diane. From Jean, is it safe to travel there now to see these things? Well, as far as I know, it's safe. Some people are traveling there. So I don't think the issue is, I don't think there's too much of a safety issue. Although many of you know that Hagia Sophia was turned back into a mosque. So I think it's safe, but a little bit frustrating because of some of those things. So yes, I think it's safe. Okay. Okay, great. Okay, all right. And let me see if there's any other questions here. Okay, thank you for your compliments. As I say, you can either unmute yourself and ask a question verbally, or you can type into the chat as well.
Alan, I have a question. What's the easiest place to find your books if someone wanted to look for them?
I hate to say it, but Amazon.
Yeah, okay, I thought so.
Yeah, you can get it. You can get all of my books on Amazon, and that's the easiest way to get them.
So Alan, the bronze charioteer in Delphi is quite beautiful. Do you think that's how he actually looked? That artistic license to a godlike status of a charioteer?
Yeah. So Karen's asking a question about a famous statue, ancient Greek statue, which of course predates quite a bit. So this is the charioteer of Delphi, a life-size bronze statue of a charioteer, and which used to have horses and an actual chariot, but in the museum today it simply stands like a freestanding sculpture, and really one of the great works of art. This particular charioteer also, by the way, chariot races were part of the Olympic Games, the Pythian Games, right? Remember, in the ancient world, there wasn't just the Olympian Games. There was the Pythian Games. There was a games every year. And so there were 4 different places. Olympia was just one of them. But the Pythian Games refer to Apollo, the god Apollo. And so there probably were some kind of chariot races having to do with the Pythian Games associated with Delphi. And it could be that charioteer. Chariots, of course, were not invented for racing. They were invented for war. They were battle. They were the tanks of the ancient world. Mesopotamians, the ancient Egyptians had chariots as war, used for war. Okay, so the sports was merely an extension of that, in a way, a cultural extension of that.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, we should go there.
Oh, well, it's one of the most amazing places that I've ever been, and it was quite by accident, and coming across that bronze charioteer was just quite mesmerizing. They just look real.
Yeah, the level of realism is really quite high in that. I mean, it even has eyelashes.
Yes, yeah, and veins in the arms.
Veins in the arms, everything, yeah. All of those things, people go and see, Michelangelo's David, and they go, oh yeah, look at that, he even put people had been doing that 2,000 years before Michelangelo. So it really does also speak to the incredible accomplishments of the ancient Greek artists.
Sure.
Good.
Alan,
Okay. So
yes.
I have another question here from, hi. Hi, Elizabeth, how are you? Nice to see you. The question is from Elizabeth is, how many obelisks were taken from Egypt to other locales? A lot. A lot of them. In Rome alone, there are, gosh, I mean, it must be a dozen in Rome alone. And of course, if you go to Paris, you know, Napoleon, when he conquered Egypt, he had to bring one or two back as well. The Place du Concorde in Paris, of course. So, and I'm pretty sure there's got to be one in England somewhere. But, and by the way, almost all of these came from the Karnak temple in Luxor, where there's actually, I think there's just one obelisk still there, but there used to be dozens. So the Romans really pillaged, well, between Napoleon Bonaparte and the ancient Romans and the Byzantines, who were the extension of the ancient Romans, they really did take all of these Egyptian obelisks away as trophies of their conquests of that ancient civilization. By the way, people also thought these things had certain kind of magical qualities and so on. So there's actually a whole book just on obelisks that's quite interesting. Yeah, good question. So only the Egyptians figured out how to make obelisks. Well, not totally so, but obelisks were, almost all of these obelisks were quarried at Aswan, the famous red granite quarries at Aswan. So if you've ever been to Egypt and you've been to Aswan, you might have visited those quarries. And there are still, in some of those quarries in Egypt, you can still see partially quarried obelisks. And of course, the Egyptians knew that granite lasted a long time. So they liked granite because they knew that it would survive the eons of history. And it does. It really does. If you think of how many years that obelisk in Istanbul has been exposed to the erosive forces. Notice that the limestone below, the marble below, of the Theodosian sculptures of the base are far more eroded than the Egyptian obelisk, which is, you know, it's sort of like 1,500 years, almost, you know, almost 2,000 years older than the base below it. So that's pretty incredible. I'm sure one of our
couple of questions a little bit further back on the charioteers themselves. Were they slaves, and how did it work with that?
Yes. Like gladiators, charioteers were almost always slaves. So in other words, they belonged to an owner. There's a record of one time a race in the Circus Maximus in Rome during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian. And there was a charioteer who had a particularly hot day, and he was just beating everybody. And the crowd chanted, "Free him, free him." And the emperor announced, he said, "I'm sorry, but I cannot free the property of another man." So he could not, even as emperor, he did not challenge one of the other Roman aristocracy who owned that charioteer. Sometimes charioteers could win their freedom or their manumission by winning a lot of money for their owners. And there are records of this, tombstones of charioteers, for example, where it says, you know, that he gained his freedom because of his great racing. So sometimes they only gained his freedom when their master died, but sometimes freedom was given by the master before that, while they were still alive. So yes, good. Somebody mentioned, Julie mentions that you also saw obelisks in Ethiopia. Yes, the obelisk culture and symbolism extended beyond the borders of Lower Egypt into Sudan and Ethiopia too. The obelisk actually does have a very long symbolism in many cultures, not just Egyptian. Okay. Yeah, I find, oh, Pierre has, Pierre Seguin has a picture of that obelisk because Pierre and I went on a trip when we were in Egypt. So thank you. I think I also have a picture of that. Jean asks, what did the slaves do after being freed? Well, they could continue being charioteers, but then they would keep a larger share of their winnings. How much money the charioteers got was kind of controlled by the team that they belonged to. Okay, so very often, I mentioned that there was team, like a red team, white team, green team, blue team. Well, these circus factions in each city were controlled by a kind of manager. Now, sometimes the main charioteer, the head charioteer, who was called a factionarios, he was also the manager of the stables and the horses. So he had multiple jobs. He had, and there was some great studies that have been done about vets. There were horse vets who took care of these horses. And they gave them, Anne McCabe has done some incredible work on how the ancients took care of their horses and the veterinary and dietary things that they did. Her research on horses has also told us what people knew about horses. They knew they had Arabian horse. They knew about Arabian horses. The best horses came from Spain, North Africa, and Cappadocia, actually, in Turkey. These were the best horses. Arabian horses were known, and they were known for the same thing that they're known for today. They can be really fast, but they're also very nervous, right? They get excited, they're excitable. And so the ancients knew these things about these horses and different breeds of horses as well. So, yeah, thank you. Shirley says, depending on how you define obelisks. Yes, obelisk. So yes, Ashoka, that's true, of course. But Ashoka erected columns, certainly columns. And the ancient Romans also had done that. Erecting of columns with things on top of them, capitals on top of them. And of course, Ashoka also, put inscriptions on these to, in his case, to propagate Buddhism throughout India. Yes, the Ashoka columns I love those too. They're great. Okay. Now, Diane asks, this is a question, I suppose, for you, Kelsey, and that is the lecture is being recorded, and where will it be available for those people who would like to see it, who maybe missed it today?
When it's ready, we usually link it in the next Armchair Exploration email that comes out. So it'll probably come out in a link next week to your emails. And then they're always posted to the Zegrahm website. So if you just click on our Armchair Exploration, all of the interactive events and things that we've recorded are all available there.
Yeah, good. No, did I miss any questions? There were a few came in there. Kelsey, do you see any that I didn't address?
I think you caught them all.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. It was a real pleasure to kind of see you, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Alan. We'll keep it open for just a couple of minutes and then I'll shut things down. But Alan, huge thank you. It was really nice to just get together and have an educational talk. So thank you very much, Alan.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate, so, in the Black Sea trip, there is lots of opportunity to spend time in Istanbul. And I assure you that even though some of you might be frustrated about, access to Hagia Sophia and so on, there are many, many wonderful things to see. And even possibly going to the Archaeological Museum and seeing the statue bases of Porphyrius there, or seeing the one part of the serpent head from the serpent column. So these are all artifacts associated with those things that we could see in that trip as well. So
Take the pre-extension.
Yeah, take the pre-extension. It's great with Susan to Cappadocia.
Cappadocia.
And we get a little bit of time in Istanbul too. You won't have Alan until he gets there, but you'll get him, and I'll take you places I'm not supposed to. Shh.
Hi, Susan.
yeah, the pre-extension is so great because also it's it's relaxing, it's more relaxing, so you can get rid of your jet lag. So by the time you get on the boat, you're feeling great. And Susan's done this many times. I think it's true to say that Susan has made a lot of friends there and knows all, so it's a really great idea to do that, and to see Cappadocia and that wonderful part of Turkey is really a treat.